Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well in a somewhat delayed weekend perspective. I had a chance to get out and see my daughter. My daughter turned 21 this weekend, so apologize for being late and getting this out on a Monday, but we had a chance to go visit her, celebrate her 20th first birthday, kind of becoming an official adult, which is, kind of a weird thing for dad. We started this podcast back when they were 5, so seeing them grow up is an interesting prospect. So anyways, hope everybody's doing well. A couple of interesting conversations I saw this past week. AI-related conversations. One of them was from the folks over at the All In podcast. So it was mostly Jason Calacanis, but he was talking to some other people. And they were kind of getting into, talking about, they were talking about AI agents and, some of the work that they were doing for various types of things, writing software, building company elements, whatever it might be. And they sort of came to this revelation, and there's links in the show notes for this, in which they were, they basically were saying like, hey, we're starting to, sort of map out and see what success looks like and these various things. And, they still sort of had human in the loop for, approving things or laying out, architectures and all sorts of stuff. And they said, hey, we're starting to run into situations in which we might be paying, $100,000 per agent. Right. And, the other person seemed sort of surprised that the numbers were getting that big. And they kind of got into this discussion, about like, hey, well, what is a good token budget for some sort of project? How do we start to compare what we pay for humans, software developers in this case, versus, what we pay an AI agent to go off and do? And, what are the characteristics of what that work looks like and so forth. But, in essence, they started getting into this conversation of basically kind of coming to a realization that, maybe you sort of ignore when there's a lot of hype going on and you're seeing outputs and so forth. But in essence, sort of coming to this realization of like, hey, there is a price associated with whatever is going on that you're building from an AI perspective. And I know that sounds sort of dumb and naive. Of course there is. You're paying for a subscription, or you're paying for some sort of license, or you're paying for GPU usage or whatever. I mean, gosh, every week we talk on this show about the billions of dollars that are pouring into this industry. Of course, somehow somebody's going to pay for them. But it's again, sort of interesting to watch people who, kind of live around this industry. They may not be, writing software every single day, but they're part of, companies that are trying to solve some sort of business problem, or writing software for various reasons. Now starting to realize, and I think, realize, hey, this, the price can start to add up pretty quickly. The cost can start to add up pretty quickly. But I think it also, begins to, kind of be an inflection point that we're now starting to see people talk about the projects that they're working on, both in terms of like, this is what we did, and then this is what it cost, and then there's also a time element to it. So so there's an output element to it, there's a time element to it, there's a cost element to it, and I think people are starting to come to some realizations of like, okay, there's some maybe potentially very, very interesting things that can get created. I'll put some links in the show notes. There's an interesting little project that got created where a couple of venture capitalists sort of bet each other, about like, hey, how far into physical AI will agents start to push? And somebody basically said like, somebody said like, well, it can't grow corn, right? It can't get into some of those types of things. And somebody said, well, let's see if that's possible. And so there's an interesting sort of project going on around, how far can an AI project manager, whatever you want to call it, kind of be involved with the process of essentially everything that you would think of in terms of a farmer doing all of the work on the land and all of the inputs to growing the corn, to being able to arrange for it to be monitored and then picked and, grown and picked and taken to market and all those sort of things. And so there's an interesting project going on. But anyways, it does feel like we are very much at an inflection point in which a bunch of elements of this are starting to become much more realistic to people, right? And I think we spent a number of years really kind of focused on like, hey, how big is a model and how much money does it cost to train a model? And, will there be an open source element so that those that don't have hundreds of billions of dollars can still participate in this economy? And, we look at, some of the personalities involved and all those things tend to shake out whenever we have, new market transitions and all this sort of stuff. And so, yeah, we've spent a number of years, kind of going through some really basic building blocks. We've looked at, some of the companies that were heavily involved. We've looked at the funding sources. We've looked at some of the behaviors that are starting to happen, right? We've talked about, coding agents and everything from, Copilot to Cursor to, should it be an IDE? Should it plug in and be a CLI? All these sorts of things. But it does feel like we're starting to, come to some more business-centric realizations about how all this stuff plugs together, right? And not so much how it plugs together, but how people are beginning to start to use it, and people are really, again, it's moving into, okay, it is a tool to go accomplish, tasks, whether those tasks are business tasks or nonprofit tasks or, for fun and enjoyment or whatever they might be. But it's interesting to watch those things sort of happen, but it's also interesting to sort of watch people get a little bit of, I don't know if the right word is sticker shock, but kind of come to this realization of like, oh, okay, that's what it would cost to do this thing that up until now it's sort of been, kind of a whiteboard exercise or a dream or hey, maybe this could kind of happen. In the same way that, if you told somebody, well, there's some technology out there that potentially could send you to the moon or send you to outer space or, allow you to live, a perfectly healthy life, 10,000 feet under the ocean or something that, in the past we'd sort of been like, well, I'm not really sure how that's going to happen, but maybe there's some pieces of technology. And the reason I bring all this sort of stuff up was the other sort of interesting conversation I saw this week, and it was a LinkedIn post. In essence was, somebody coming to a similar type of conclusion in which they were starting to put some projects together. They were starting to see some interesting results. They were starting to spin up more agents. They were starting to, understand how to coordinate these things, where to have the projects go off and build some things on their own, where to have a human in the loop, where to, stop and pause and look at, where things were going and then analyze, where it should go from there. And the second sort of data point that got me thinking about this week's topic was really, this person kind of laying out saying, well, do we think in the future, given that, at a minimum, we're going to see software developers of every ilk, of every, level of seniority, be given these coding tools. They're already beginning to do this. We've heard, Brandon Winter's been on a number of times saying, hey, look, the way software was developed in the past, like that is completely gone at this point. Everybody is going to use some sort of assistance in trying to make things better, do more with less, all those sorts of things. And this person basically said, hey, do we expect, given the sort of token budget that's starting to add up for all these things, and people not really truly understanding what that means yet, because the things that are getting created, they're just like, that was amazing. That took a few hours or a few days or a few weeks. I would have thought that would have taken years, right? They're starting to go, well, that's really cool, but I can't do that for every single one of my projects. I don't necessarily know that I have the budget to do that. And so the second data point basically came along and said, well, why are we necessarily, doing things in these fully centralized ways only through, centralized cloud platforms or these gigantic data centers that are built by the frontier models at the basically the highest premium that we can that exists out there, right? Like you're paying a premium for all of the research, you're paying a premium for the data centers, you're paying a premium for the GPUs and all those sorts of things. And they sort of said, well, what if instead, and again, this is just sort of sort of the other end of the spectrum, what if we just said, look, hey, every developer, yes, you have your own development box, you've got a MacBook or whatever the heck you have. What if we also gave them sort of a secondary box, something like a Mac Mini, which has a GPU in it, and we allowed them in this distributed manner to, go off and sort of generate their own tokens, if you will, right? And again, there's probably lots of debate about how complicated that would be. It's the classic sort of, should computing be centralized versus should computing be decentralized. But it is oftentimes, historically, if we look back over many years and many transitions, our industry tends to go through these things of centralization to decentralization, back to centralization, back to decentralization. And in these transitions is when we start to see not only, a complete change of sort of the economics of how early stages of projects versus large stages of projects versus, whatever tend to evolve. But we also begin to see, software play a far bigger role in figuring out how to best optimize when things are centralized, but also then how to do coordination and orchestration when things are decentralized, right? So, again, think about this. We went from, the mainframe completely centralized to the mini computer, which again was sort of centralized, but at a smaller scale. So that began to change the economics of who could begin to get involved. Then we started to see the PC come along. And again, that was sort of distributed, but kind of centralized for an individual person. Then we began to see local area networks, wide area networks. We began to see technology that allowed file sharing and, Novell and a whole bunch of other things. Those were, those became distributed, right? Then we began to see the internet, which was, that on a massive scale, this distribution on a massive scale. So, information from all over the world was being available to you at on the other end of a link, at the end of a click. And then we saw that for a long time. We saw that for, small, medium-sized businesses, large businesses. And then we began to see the cloud and we began to see SaaS and things that really sort of centralized, where computing was taking place. And that, that had the opportunity to take, the value of the distributedness in the past, but also the inefficiencies that went along with that. When you start distributing, things get more efficient. You've got more stuff that has to go out over the network. You've got more things to keep up with. The cloud kind of came along and said, "Oh, well, let me re-centralize these things again. Let me make compute cost efficient, and let me make where data is located efficient." And I could do things like EC2 and S3 and all that kind of stuff. And then again, we had mobile, and mobile became a distributed thing, and so people had to figure out, okay, this is really powerful. We've put the power back in the hands of the users at various price points. But how do I manage those things? How do I coordinate stuff? New applications got built. And I think what was interesting to me was, it felt like, and again, I'm always looking for, a couple of data points to begin to start to look at, maybe a trend, maybe something to consider, maybe a new behavior was, again, people are beginning to use these agents on more and more of a basis. The realization of like how to think about them in a business context. Again, work got done. How much did that work cost? How long did that work take? And the realization of like, well, that was interesting and powerful, but maybe the economics of that aren't terribly efficient, because this does seem like a pattern that people would like to replicate. And then you're beginning to see people sort of, across various points in the spectrum in the other direction of like a less centralized model begin to go, okay, what's possible there? And so I think it's going to be really interesting throughout 2026 as we see these agent technologies evolve to really sort of watch and see not only what people are building with these agents, and I think there's going to be a kind of a long period of time, a year, 2 years, 3 or 4 years, where people are still going to be fascinated by how to treat these agents somewhat as augmentation to humans, some cases to be completely autonomous, and then everywhere in between. But at the same time, begin to figure out, okay, just like any other transition we made, where we all of a sudden had 10x the amount of capabilities that we had before, 100x the capabilities we had before. What does that look like from an economics perspective? And there are going to be people that build it in ways that, are probably going to be the most expensive, but maybe they're going to be going very fast to begin with. And then you're going to see people that are going to begin to build these far lower cost systems that may not do the most mission critical things, but could do 100 things, 500 different things, whatever those things might be, at a price point that a vast majority of the market can kind of begin to adapt to. So I think we're going to start to see more conversations, and these will bubble up into the enterprise as well, of people saying, should we ultimately begin to own our own tokens, meaning, we have more control over that. We're paying far less of a premium for all this sort of stuff. We're seeing more and more open models and other types of things become available. But I think it's going to, we're going to see people begin to ask the question of like, what's your token budget for that project? And it's a very complicated thing to understand because, translating tokens into dollars, into inputs, into outputs is very complicated. Because a token is like 3 or 4 words. It could be a few letters. It could be, like it's not a, it's not a specific atomic sort of unit that you can just go like, oh, well, 800,000 tokens is a small website, or, 400,000 tokens is a, or whatever. So, I think there's going to be a lot of learning that'll happen in that space. I think there'll be a lot of evolution of like how we talk about these atomic AI sort of concepts, and then translate those into, life concepts and business concepts and dollars and cents and so forth. But it does feel like, as we sit here in sort of, mid to late February 2026, the light bulb is starting to go on for a number of people. I'm going to say early adopters, not mainstream yet necessarily, but I do expect to see, more and more of that broader conversation happening, not just a fascination with, how many billions or hundreds of billions of objects were, used to train a model, or, tens of billions of dollars used to train a model. I think we're going to get into the more, okay, I want to do a project. How much does that project cost? And what's the most efficient way to get there? The way that, people think about every day, doing an upgrade on their house or a project at work. How many people is it going to take? How much time do we have? What's our budget? What's the output? It does feel like we're beginning to become a little bit aware of how to connect those dots. And I think that's going to be, there's going to be a learning curve. It's interesting to sort of watch the early adopters. But, you read through some of the things that are being done, and you go, okay, this is going to be very tangible for a lot of people. But I think it's going to be interesting to watch. Again, AI is a fascinatingly powerful technology. It's also, at this point, still the most, potentially expensive computing we've ever seen. And again, you can do lots of projects for $50 and you go, oh, well, that wasn't that expensive. But the cost of getting there is, versus the amount of information or intelligence you get, is going to be a really interesting kind of transition, or at least a ratio that people are going to have to start figuring out. So anyways, no real conclusions for today's show, but kind of an interesting, feels like we're beginning to, take a few more steps over another peak up this mountain and this journey that we're all on, and beginning to feel like the conversations are moving a little less from, purely technology to, how does this relate to sort of real life things in ways that we've done that in the past. So we'll be covering that quite a bit on the show. I expect that we will be covering that quite a bit here in 2026 and into 2027. But love to hear people's feedback on their projects, how they're starting to think about, connecting the dots on all these sort of things, and just like in the early days of cloud, everything in cloud seemed super, super cheap. And then all of a sudden, you had 50 services running across 4 different regions, and you were like, God, I had no idea I got a $7,000 bill over the weekend for that project I was working on. So, we've seen these things before. We will see them again, but interesting to watch this new context of how people are, connecting the dots between, early new technology, innovative technology, and just the dollars and cents and the economics of what the outputs of those things look like. So anyways, with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. Sorry, this one was a day late, but I feel like it was a good excuse for being a day late. So with that, I'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.